starting from the beginning, and I'll only tell you what we know for sure. But we know that Zebulon Heston was approximately 14 or 15 years old when he came from England, and we don't know exactly where, we have no proof, to America. And we only know that he came in the company of a man called Benjamin Wiggins, which we assume paid for his passage over here, because Zebulon only was 14 or 15. He couldn't have had any money. We speculate that he came from the village of Heston near London, England. And we speculate, I've been to the Heston, and I went to the library there and discovered that there had been a boys' orphanage in Heston about the time that Zebulon came to America. And there was an upset going on in England where there had been a plot against the king, and the Duke of Monmouth, his bastard son, and his cronies wanted to kill the king. And supposedly the plot failed, or definitely failed. And they hired a guy named the Hanging Judge Jeffreys to supposedly find out who did this plot against the king. As a consequence, he killed approximately 254 people for the plot, none of whom was the Duke of Monmouth or his friends. The hanging judge just took anybody that they wanted to and proceeded to hang them, including one poor woman who only gave some clothing and food to one of the Cornish farm boys that were fleeing from the judge, and they hung her for abetting a possible criminal. So anyway, we only assume that when Zebulon got here to America, because we can find no trace of anyone named Heston in England, we can only assume that he was an orphan boy who had no last name. So when he got here to America, he had to have one. So we think that he may have taken the name of the village he was from, which was Heston. And he had to become an indentured servant of Benjamin Wiggins to work off his passage to America. And that was the rule back in the day. He landed in the Boston area, and he could not leave the Boston area until he could be declared a free man. And by that, they meant free of debt. He had to pay back Benjamin Wiggins every penny of what the passage cost. So he was either there for 5 to 7 years. And we think, according to it was the Iowa Ledger newspaper, said that he was a blacksmith. Zebulon became a blacksmith, and we think that he might have worked in the first forge that was in Easton, Massachusetts, on the Cape Cod Peninsula, and learned how to forge steel, or metal at that time, iron. So he went ahead and he worked off his indenture, and finally he was free. And we know then that he went to Long Island, New York. And apparently he didn't feel comfortable there because he kept right on going after a bit and went down to Hopewell Township, New Jersey. And there he met the Hutchinson family, and most specifically he met Dorothy Hutchinson, whom he fell in love with. And he decided he wanted to marry her. Well, she was Quaker. She and her family were Quaker. So we believe that Zebulon became Quaker so he could marry Dorothy. And he and his brothers-in-law helped build some of the first free churches or open churches in the state of New Jersey. They built these public meeting houses who were supposed to be non-denominational, in other words, for any religion, which was an unheard of thing back in the day. And they built 2 of them. And I actually visited the remains of one, which is now on the grounds of the state mental institution in the back. But there's still a tiny graveyard, and there were a couple graves left there, none of which were Heston specifically. But we know that those public meeting houses had been built. So after a bit, he and Dorothy were married. They had about 3 small children. And all of a sudden, the sentiment in New Jersey changed. And the Episcopalians did not want other religions in New Jersey. So they started to harass the Quakers. So Zebulon and Dorothy and their 3 young children were forced to flee New Jersey in the middle of the night, going through the woods to get to the Delaware River. And on the other side of the Delaware River was Bucks County, Pennsylvania, the safe haven for Quakers. And while they were going through the woods in the dark, they met up with a neighbor who also was fleeing. So they joined up together, and they got across the Delaware River safely to Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And Zebulon started all over as a farmer. And he had quite a farm. It's now under the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So you will not find it. It's under there. And that's where his grave is also, under the Pennsylvania Turnpike. They did not respect graves back then. So anyway, he and his family remained in Bucks County, Pennsylvania for 3 generations. At least my line did. There was Zebulon the first, the second, and the third. The third got a little restless, and he started the trek west. Remember, we had promised the Indians, first of all, we would never go past the Allegheny Mountains. Well, we broke that promise. Then we promised we wouldn't go west of the Ohio River. So everybody that could, who wanted their own homesteads, started traveling west, and they all piled up in Washington County, Pennsylvania, on the border of the Ohio River. And we were told by our government that we could not cross the river. And those who did ended up and tried to homestead without the permission of the government ended up having their farms burned, and they were sent back across the river to Pennsylvania. Finally, about 1805, the government relented and said, okay, if you want to settle in Ohio, we'll let you settle in Ohio, and we'll send the Indians further west. So that's what we did. All of a sudden, there was the Ohio Territory, the Indiana Territory, and the Illinois Territory, and we started spreading out as settlers. After we promised them, though, that we wouldn't go across the Mississippi. We didn't hold that promise either, but that was a while to go. In my particular family, we settled first in Harrison County, Ohio. And the 5th generation was a man named William, and he married an Ann Brockman or Buckman, we're not positive. And Twilla and I have the same ancestry going up to this family. But anyway, they were the tanners in the village. And the tanners were social outcasts because they didn't smell very good. So they had to live on the edge of the village. And I noticed in the census report that William and Ann did not know how to read or write. So they didn't get much education, and they broke away from the Quaker religion, which ends our excellent record of where the family was those first 4 generations once William and Ann stopped being Quaker. So anyway, as far as I know, we continued, my family did, to go from Ohio to Indiana. We lived a short while in Martin County, Indiana, and then my grandfather was actually born in Galesburg, Illinois. And my grandfather was William Martin Heston, also known as Wee Willie. And he was a very poor farm boy. His father was a tenant farmer who never did very well, unfortunately. He tried to raise cattle, and Willie had to go out and take care of the cattle 8 months out of the year, and was only able to go to school 4 months a year, the winter months. So he didn't graduate high school until he was 20 years old, because he was an excellent student, but he wasn't able to go to school very much. But we'll get to that in a minute. So anyway, finally, John William Heston, his father, was able to get his Civil War disability money that he should have gotten way back when, but they had messed up his name and they wouldn't give him the money. But he finally got his settlement, and with that, the family gave up the steer raising and sold off the cattle and moved to Grants Pass, Oregon by train. And that's where my grandfather actually went to high school. And he was top of his class, but he had a girl, there was a girl in school that also got the same grade point average he did. So as a result, the high school would not let him speak as a valedictorian. Neither of them got to speak. So anyway, he left there and went down to San Jose State Teachers College, and went there for 2 years, and there he saw his first football. He had never touched a football before in his life. He had walked up, he met a guy who he was mowing the lawn for, and the boy took a look at Willie and said, "Hey, why don't you play football?" And my grandfather said, "I never saw football. What are you talking about?" He says, "I'll teach you." Well, Grandpa was taught how to play. The second year he was playing so well, they made him captain of the team. And there was a game at Stanford University in California where they had hired this Fielding Yost to come and coach them for a big game they were going to play. And the San Jose players heard about this Fielding Yost. So Fielding Yost did the job for Stanford, and he was going to go back to Michigan. He was from the University of Michigan. And Willie and the other friend of his traveled to Palo Alto, where Stanford is, and begged Fielding Yost to come and coach them for a game against Stanford. So Fielding Yost agreed to come, and he coached them. And San Jose State Teachers College beat Stanford in that game. So my grandfather theoretically graduated. You could graduate in 2 years back in the day to be a teacher. And he thought he was going to go back to Oregon, where his family was living, and he actually summer taught in Wolf Creek, Oregon. And he got a letter from Fielding Yost. And Fielding Yost wrote to him and said, "Willie, if you can get to Ann Arbor, I'll find a place for you on the team." So my grandfather did. He went down to, I'm sorry.
Are you the husband?
Yes.
I'm Jan Ballard.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm just giving a little talk.
Thank you.
We went down to San Francisco, and he was a scab for a fruit carriers group that wanted more money to carry fresh fruit into San Francisco. And it was so scary to him, he said, "I'll never be a scab again." I mean, there were riots like you wouldn't believe. People were being beaten to death. And Willie said, I want no part of this. But while he was in San Francisco, he met a man on the street who told him that he had a return ticket to Toledo, Ohio in his pocket that he would sell him for half price because he had decided he loved San Francisco so much he was staying there. He wasn't going to return. So Grandpa Willie was able to buy the ticket for half price. He got to Toledo, Ohio, took a bus up to Ann Arbor, and landed there with $2.50 in his pocket. And he's standing on the street corner with his suitcase, not knowing where to go, and all of a sudden he gets a kick in the butt. Turns around and there's Fielding Yost. So he said, you know, welcome to Ann Arbor. So he took him, put him in the team, and Willie went through law school while he played football for Fielding Yost. And Fielding Yost's teams became known as the point-a-minute teams. Those football teams were so good, they had one year a score of 565 points or something like that to 0 for the opponents. They were unbeatable, and Willie became a Hall of Famer, and they were unbeatable. And it was a tremendous thing. And back in those days, they could play football for 4 years. Now you can't. You're redshirted for the first year, and then you only can play 3 years. But he played 4. And that's probably why he had the record of 93 touchdowns in 4 years. A record that's never been broken. But that's only because probably because he played 4 years, and probably because he got fast running after the cattle, or running from the cattle when he was in Kansas. But anyway, so he went on to become a circuit court judge, and he was interested in genealogy. So he did a little bit of genealogy, and when my dad was grown, or in college actually, he started getting interested in genealogy. Now this is John Penrod Heston, his son, second son. So both his first son, William Martin Heston Jr., and my father tried playing football for University of Michigan, but they were never as great as Willie. They were good, but not great. So anyway, my dad started doing genealogy. While he was still in college, he started to write to people, and that was his real attribute. He could get people to send him pages and pages of data. They would, you know, give their whole history and everything. I don't know how he did it, how he got so many people engaged in writing to him, but he had a 4-drawer file cabinet, and several of the drawers were just letters from people giving him their genealogy. So my father got the idea of doing the Heston Historian, which is 4 times a year. He published a newspaper all about Hestons, starting from when Zebulon first came over, and then he tried to date it with the birth of the first daughter and the birth of the second daughter, and so on and so forth. And he was going to do a whole series. Well, he started that in '57, as you pointed out, and then in 1961 he had a pretty serious heart attack. So he never again wrote another Heston Historian, but I think there were about 13 issues. 19, including the directories that he did. Okay. There were maybe 13 newspaper issues and about 6 directories where he just had names and dates and so forth, but not newspaper style. But he had a whole staff at the cemetery that helped him do all that printing and typing and stuff. I will tell you that. But anyway, so he had given up the genealogy at that point, and when he died, my mom was going to throw it all out. And I said, no. I said, you can't do that. I said, I will take one file drawer at a time, and I'll bring it back to Chicago, where I was now living, and I will try to learn how to do genealogy. I had done a little bit for him when I was a girl. I used to go to the library with him and copy out names and dates forever from different books, but I really didn't know what I was doing. So I brought the stuff home, and I had to learn how to do genealogy. And I did the book. I did like a 800-page book, and as soon as I was done, it was already outdated because I learned so much more. And now I have a dedicated computer that just has genealogy in it. It's not connected to the internet because I had done it all once before, and I had a crash and I lost all my data, and I had to start over again. And one of the things I lost I could never recover are all these stories, wonderful stories about the family that my dad had gathered and I had put into the computer and then lost these stories. I was able to reconstruct the genealogies, but not the stories. And that's a tragedy there, because the papers had been getting old and they had been down the basement. And so as I put them into the computer, I threw the papers out. And that's when I had the crash. So I had to start again. A year, I couldn't even look at the computer for a year, but I finally did. I fortunately had a listing of everyone's name and birth date, and from that I was able to reconstruct all the genealogy. And then I bumped into Our Family online, and Ancestry.com and RootsWeb.com, and I was able to quadruple what I had before. So I have them on discs, but we don't have any electricity, so you're not going to be able to see it, but I do have them. But it's been quite an adventure, and it's one of my favorite hobbies, is doing genealogy. So does anyone have any questions?
I want that book.
You want that book? I'll arm wrestle you. No. I'm kidding.